Suzanne takes you down to her place near the river.
When you're at UCLA's Center for the Art of Performance, it's not about one venue. It's literally wherever we are, it's a state of being. And so, for example, we work in dance, we work in curating in jazz. There's a lot of different kind of global music that comes through as well. There's theater, international, national, and local. And we do a lot with writers and cultural commentators. We put them in a discussion. It's a kind of sub-program called Words and Ideas. Roots music, visual art collaborations, interdisciplinary. So it's a big swath of different kinds of artistic literacies and incredible thinkers and makers.
That was Christy Edmunds, our guest for today's podcast.
And you want to travel with her, and you want to travel blind, and you know that she will trust you for you.
Hello, I'm Suzanne Taylor. Welcome to my podcast, Searching for Unity in Everything, meaningful conversations with meaningful people. How can we turn the world around? Can we turn the world around? Everything I've done has been in that pursuit, buoyed up by that famous quote by Margaret Mead, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." I am lucky to live in a city where Kristy, who since 2005 has headed up and revolutionized arts institutes, arts festivals, and arts schools in Portland, Oregon, Melbourne, Australia, and at the Park Avenue Armory in New York City, that you can read about on our podcast page. She has, since 2012, curated a major theater program near me at UCLA. There are plenty of good shows in Los Angeles, and I buy tickets for a lot of them. But I don't subscribe to seasons and donate to anything except what Kristy delivers as the executive and artistic director for the Center for the Art of Performance, known as CAP, which does programs at various venues on the UCLA campus and at the Theater at the Ace Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Soon also to be producing smaller shows at a theater UCLA just bought, thanks to a donation from Leonard and Susan Nimoy, near UCLA. In a world of separation, CAP feels like family to me. I don't know how Kristy can be so personal with all the donors, but she's a great hugger. And at each of the many performances where she gets on the stage to settle the audience in and to make, as she characterizes it, a memory in a living archive that completes the work, I'm moved by her warmth and her insight into how what we are about to see will ennoble our lives. In a generation that frames value by monetary success and high levels of visibility, she helps us see beyond that, creating safe spaces for dangerous ideas that, as she says, go deeply into the fabric of how we belong in space and time. Truth be known, I'd love Kristy's job, pulling in some 55 programs a year of contemporary performing arts from all over the world, of dance, theater, music, people talking about the arts, in a broad gamut, going from established companies to artists she discovers, where she spends even years helping to develop what we eventually see. How Christy Edmunds has shaken up contemporary art is a headline of one article about her, which explains how long-proven and regionally familiar art with a stock and trade of companies before she came along, which, as the article says, left a rather large gulf between the ideas and work of living artists and the towering significance of the established canon. So, Kristy, I thought we'd start by your telling us about your childhood and what got you into the arts in the first place, but then gave you the nerve to be the person who selects what so many thousands of people are going to pay money to see.
Wow, Sue, that was quite an introduction, I have to say. I'm slightly, chuffed. Thank you for having me. I think, as a kid, we didn't grow up with very many means, and we didn't grow up in a place that was, in the kind of urban epicenters of where a lot of artistic practice was happening. But I did grow up in a family where on my father's side, there was a lot of musicians, and on my mother's side, they were artisans and craftspeople, sculptors. She was a potter. So I in one way or another, became very familiar with the rhythms and the joy of the way in which people could be brought together through the art. And I also would have witnessed the way in which they kept at things, especially her. She kept at things all the time. And when you look at something and the amount of hours and time and the risk associated with putting a kiln load of pottery together that was never going to compensate her for that level of care or anything. It's not why she did it. She did it to put love in the world with the talent that she had. And she focused a ton of time on perfecting it and conjoined me into that process. So I think my mom is a really huge influence in relation to that. But actually, it was just nobody was pursuing success as we know it in this time. They were pursuing a way of making something that truly put love into the world from their hand or their heart or the combination therein. And I, showed pretty early predisposition for making things. I would constantly, to entertain myself, be making things. I'd make puppets out of apricot pits. I'd make little plays. I'd work on strange little menus. I would draw. And eventually, by the time that I got to going to university, I decided that I would major in filmmaking and kind of minor in visual art. Visual art being something that I could make, and film to me seemed like an avenue through which I might be able to tell stories or show places that I'd lived, because we also moved very, very frequently. And so I thought, how do I take something forward that is useful? And film for me was that. But I didn't understand. I always was working in short documentaries. They were rather abstract. And at one point, I started to think, God, if I don't know how to work with actors, or I don't understand something about theater and its narratives, I'll always be making little documentaries, which led me into producing theater projects. And then I noticed, dancers and choreographers are kind of doing the same thing, just without words. I wonder how we collaborate with them. And I just started really that process. So my childhood and my early growing up, before I started out professionally, was really about exploring through curiosity how I could contribute in ways that I saw my family doing.
So how about that last part of the question, Kristy? What gives you the nerve to think that you could go and select so many performances that so many people are going to sit there and pay money to see? I mean, how do you get the nerve to do that?
Well, somebody's got to do it, Sue. Somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to stick themselves out there and say, here are the things that I have seen, have worked on with artists. Here are artists that have entrusted us with their new work and ideas, and how to put that into some kind of shape and form with a limited budget here in Los Angeles. But I've been, curating and being an artistic director for a long time. There's thousands, yes, in the audience, but there's also an accumulated thousands and thousands of artists that I've worked with, whether I bring the work to full fruition and present it, or I help it along by connecting it to another institution or context that's going to best suit and best frame the work of where that artist is. And that can be, a small regional community center in Australia somewhere, or outside of Portland, or outside of here on the coast, or whatever. How do you work to fuel a way in which our infrastructure in the arts can support the momentum of an artist and their creative ideas? So yes, you take a lot of risk, both with the audience and will people decide to, leap towards something they don't know, or abandon the proposition. Or with the artists is where I feel the most kind of risk, actually, is how do I make sure that I'm upholding the integrity of their ideas on our stages or in the city writ large, and how to, have a kind of unbridled commitment to that possibility.
I just love all the places you come from, that the whole upbringing where it wasn't just all about making money and, the way the world runs now, and that you're concerned about the artists, and that, I'd be shaking in my boots thinking, what will the audience think? But then I want to tell our audience that people are on their feet all the time applauding those programs. Like, I think everybody feels the way I feel, that we are so lucky to have you doing this. I don't know how you get the confidence, but it's well-founded because the programs are just amazing. I thought, we're right at the beginning, not quite, almost. When this podcast comes out, we'll be right at the beginning of when your new UCLA season will start. I think your first one was 12-13. Now this is 19-20. I do want to give you a platform to sell it, so to speak, to tell people what you have coming up, to really acquaint the audience with why they should be not only coming, but becoming donors also to UCLA, which is a lovely experience. There's nothing like that. There's plenty of other donor organizations in Los Angeles, and none of them treat their donors the way you do. It's such a personal thing. It feels so good to be part of it. So let me give you just a little soapbox, to expound upon what this season's going to be all about.
Well, there's never really a theme that I'm working on, but for everyone who's listening, when you're at this, UCLA's Center for the Art of Performance, it's not about one venue. It's literally wherever we are, it's a state of being. It's a state of being. And so, like, for example, we work in dance, we work in curating in jazz. There's a lot of different kind of global music that comes through as well. There's theater, international, national, and local. And we do a lot with writers and cultural commentators. We put them in a discussion. It's a kind of sub-program called Words and Ideas. Roots music, visual art collaborations, interdisciplinary. So it's a big swath of different kinds of artistic literacies, I would say, and incredible thinkers and makers. So the first one we have coming up, I think, is a pretty good example of working in, it illuminates the way in which we, or I, and then us all work together. And it's Adam Linder. And Adam Linder is a choreographer. He doesn't think of choreography so much in the way of creating an ensemble of virtuous dancers, although they are. He thinks of it as a kind of analysis of a particular topic. And he uses movement and lighting design and costuming to crack into these pretty lofty concepts. So Adam, we're presenting, and we helped co-commission with the Hebel Theater in Berlin his newest work. It's called The Want. And it really looks at, the things that you're alluding to as well in this talk. He explores the way in which the kind of mercantile, the merchant class of Europe, that since even prior to that, this continuous level of constant trade. And when trade takes over beyond the exchange of things that are necessary or things that are curiosities across cultures that they want to participate in, and the exchange of trade in that regard, to the things that actually trade becomes the single most important power hierarchy that there is, and how we're coping with it now. What it means to, if you don't have something to trade, like often artists don't, and yet they do. The dancers are really expressing the labor of dance. They are laborers. They are there to do a job. There's an exchange with an audience, but he explores what these kinds of monetary hierarchies actually are. So the want is about desire for belonging against the face of trade. And we commissioned it. So several years ago, he brought me a sketchbook, really, and it was this collage pastiche of a number of different ideas that he had. And I had seen him when he was a younger dancer many, many years ago, and was aware of his kind of now choreographic sensibilities. And he had won the Mohn Prize several years ago for the Hammer Art Museum's biennial called Made in LA. And one of the things that he did, and it really struck me, was that that has a monetary award, and he divided it absolutely equally across all of the dancers, everyone who worked on that show. So he didn't take it in his self just for him to put into the making of new work, but as the way of sharing the co-authorship that invariably happens in a collaboration, which speaks volumes to his integrity, his way of approaching his relationship to the world. So anyway, this was a new idea. He had a sketchbook, all these collage pictures. You can't possibly see what he's going to make because it's sort of the point of a doodle on a napkin and a sketch in a sketchbook. but you can see what is driving him, what the aesthetics are. And I knew that we would commit to this project, so we offered co-commissioning support. And co-commissioning is the investment of resources into an artist during creative development of an idea, so that they're not constantly on the hustle and they're not constantly, writing grant applications and dealing with all of the tributaries of, knitting together some resource base to rehearse their ideas before a public and develop their costumes and whatever else. And we did it with the Hebel Theater. The Hebel in Berlin is a very long-standing theater company, theater venue, extraordinary in what they do. And my colleague and I there said, yes, let's get behind Adam's work. And so they did the world premiere there. This was maybe 9 months ago. And then it comes here in September. And we're doing it at Red Cat because that's the venue that has the right scale of intimacy with enough of the technology. And they too have a Sympatico Mission they come at things at a different level than we do. So it was, normally organizations won't collaborate because they're in competition for resources. And I've always been of the mind that if we can make a kind of linked, shared approach, we strengthen the potential of that work. So it's a very exciting representation of many different scales of collaboration to bring an idea from 3 years ago into the stage of not only Europe and also here. It will tour around in the US as well. So that's just one very detailed, probably overly detailed example. As I said, he's talking about labor, he's talking about trade, he's talking about yearnings, and he does it in this immaculate, very beautiful kind of world that he creates through his project. If people were only coming to dance programming here, the next thing that they would see is Sankaijuku. Sankaijuku is the kind of living link to the original founders of Buto, a very specific Japanese dance form that came out of the avant-garde in the kind of 40s, and in the early 50s, they had trained their bodies to perform this unique way of moving. And in a way, if you're an artist and you're a citizen of Japan and you're trying to cope with, how do we dance after the atomic age in a country that has witnessed what happens to bodies? And it torques and twists and melts and does things to the body. So they use some of that gestural damage to create these poetic, deeply poetic meditations on time. And so Amagatsu, who is the founder and leader of Sankaijuku, will be here. And he's run that company for 40 years now. And it's probably the third time that they've been in Los Angeles. And this piece, Maguri, is very much about a meditation on the natural world. And it alerts us to climate change and the awesome power of nature's capacity and our way of trying to traverse this time more lightly than urgently lightly, and with a poetic regard. And the season goes on from there. It's like Maya Beiser and Wendy Whalen and David Lang, Lucinda Childs, they have a project in the dance realm. But if I flip over also to jazz, these are hugely accomplished. These are like towering figures in the art form right now. And the thing I love about working with jazz artists is that they always build off of someone who influenced them quite palpably and visibly while they're trying to expand the terrain of new ways of dressing the phenomenal amount of knowledge that happens with notes and in between the notes, that they acknowledge where they were influenced, who influenced them in the past. And so they're always carrying the past forward while innovating to add themselves to it. So, Chick Corea is with us, and Aaron Neville is coming in, and, there's just Josh Redman, the Bad Plus. There's a lot. Aine Gordon is the first on the theater season, and he has a piece that he made called 217 Boxes of Dr. Henry Anonymous. And it's a story about him going through the archive of psychiatrists. That's where the 217 boxes kind of come from. But he was a psychiatrist, John Fryer, who in 1974 in Dallas at the American Association of Psychiatry, he put a mask on his face, he altered his voice on the stage, and he came out as a gay man. And he knew that his career would be jeopardized if they knew who he was. But people kind of cottoned on to it. And a year later, homosexuality was stricken from the manual of disorders. It was immediately recognized that they'd been treating it as a disorder for different kinds of political and cultural reasons. But in the scientific world, there was no cause to be treating this as some form of error in the human psyche. And that shifted things for the gay community writ large, right there on the spot. And it's a story about his archives, his reflection on being gay, the people around him that kept protecting him from ever coming out and kept him in the closet, and how he overcame those things. And so this is a beautiful play. And Aim Gordon he's a performance maker that's been around for a long time. He's an exquisite storyteller. He's not at the heights of fame. He's not off trying to have a hustle inside of Hollywood and then do his theater work on the side. He lives and breathes in theater and tells stories and is a massive advocate for, the human soul, really, and how the stories that are less visible matter deeply to a culture in its pockets of less visibility as well. We feel relief when we see something on stage that directly relates to our own humble selves. And he is a wizard in so many regards. So, it gives you a sense, right?
Absolutely. Of course, we could go on for hours. It occurs to me to tell the audience, one of the wonderful things about being a donor, for most of the shows, we get to meet the artists afterwards. We have a donor lounge, and we have lovely champagne, and we can talk to these artists afterwards. It's just so wonderful. It just feels so cozy, and yet, obviously, from what you've said, our audience can see how impressive these things are. These are monumental things, Not only monumental in terms of artists who already are monumental, but ones that you're bringing to the fore who just get this wonderful platform to deliver such originality, things that you just cannot see elsewhere. And then I'd also forgotten, you're at the Red Cat this year. You keep expanding your venues. I don't know that you've ever been there before, but I'm so excited that I have tickets for these things. But I can't wait to see them now, even more so than before. If I asked you a question like, what's been your biggest challenge? Do you have any?
I try and flip a challenge into saying, okay, here's like a, pretty significant obstacle. How do I get around it, get under it, go over it, move through it? How does it turn into an opportunity to think differently about how we're going to get there? But the number one obstacle, historically in the US, the biggest obstacle we have in the arts, especially those which are about originality, and I love that's what you described. This is authentic and it's original work from artists who are not typically household names, although they may be, another 10, 15 years into their practice if they can sustain it. Our biggest challenge is the resourcing of these ideas. And the resourcing of those ideas, yes, is money, but it's also talent. The talent to think in the shoes of the artist and anticipating needs they will have along the way that help them stay on course, or pushing back the headwinds that are asking them to change an idea into a formula that will make it more instantaneously successful. They're not entertainers per se, which doesn't mean that what they're doing is not profoundly entertaining, but it is not the motive. How to entertain is about how to create the sameness in an audience response for the heightened amount of resourcing coming back. These are artists, true artists, who, if you already know the outcome you're going to get, you're not going to make the project. They're pursuing an intangible, unknown outcome while finding form and shape and contour and marrying it with the kind of ethos of the day, the issues that are preoccupying us in some way. And they can do it by shaking us by the throat, and they can do it by offering something profoundly sublime that the perspective of that gives us relief. So resourcing is one, it's big. And in LA, that is slightly more challenging than other places I've worked at. But the other kind of obstacles that I end up hitting are more about the time we're living in now. People are exhausted from their work, from their own hustle in their daily lives, the absolute overwhelm of work, right? Most people, even if you have this sort of 9 to 5 repetitive sort of job, you literally are not working only 9 to 5, in any way, shape, or form. So there's the preoccupation of people who feel slightly exhausted and trying to convince them that coming out and extending their day to have this experience amongst friends and strangers is actually beneficial to what it means to be part of culture and heritage and engaging with things that are outside of our path, the path we're walking on. So I have to do a lot of, I would say, convincing, and that can be a challenge. But the things that are really huge in this time are also visas. How we go about the visas, will they come through? The process was rigorous anyway, but now in this administration, it's kind of extreme. It's very extreme. So there's almost like a sub-industry in cost, as well as can we approve these visas? And this can be an artist from Australia or Ireland or wherever, let alone Mali or Africa or Latin America. So it's uneven, it's robust. There's a kind of constant anxiety until you get the visas approved. And the number of individuals or firms or immigration lawyers that you have to engage to thread this needle. And you can see over time, even with me, who's very, it's like, oh, I will take this on. I'm going to take this on because this has to happen for every kind of reason, right? But when I look around at my colleagues, and even with me, you start to see there will probably become, in this country, in the next while, less international work. It adds the expense. It adds to the uncertainty. It adds to the pressure of the relationship with the artists. And it definitely is, unless you're bringing some massively famous historic figure from another country, the audience definitely has a harder time knowing who these people are. So it also affects all of those things. And then there's, permits and regulations and all the other kinds of things. And somehow you have to use your creativity to figure out, little tributaries that you might take, or questions that you might ask differently, or a marketing plan that may generate a different way of connecting to your colleagues as audience members that kind of buttress up and say, I now have to do this as a form of voting. Like I'm voting with my feet to get to this show. So it's a lot of those kinds of things.
I think I've seen you at just about every show I've been at, and it's amazing to me how calm you always are. Seems like everything's a piece of cake, and yet I know it has to be, oh my gosh, the challenges of all of this. Is there any, just for juicy's sake, any biggest disappointment you might point to? Anything that, you really couldn't pull off?
Yeah, some of the things that I couldn't pull off, I end up thinking to myself, I can't really cite those because I'm still going to keep trying. There's definite disappointments. There's, I remember sometimes they're little disappointments. It's usually an audience member that, for example, is, how would I say it? They're like stuck on traffic on the 405 and they start calling in to get a refund from their ticket because they're like, I'm going to be 20 minutes late at this point. So you have this little tiny heartbreaks because not only are they not going to make it, and I know they probably obviously wanted to be there, but the fact of them knowing that I still have the same economy at play and they want a refund, that kind of hurts. And then there's big disappointments. I mean, there's disappointments sometimes with an artist that we could not get the visa. We could not get the visa through, and the show is not going to happen. Usually those kinds of realities, like you'll see us sometimes put out into the messaging for members and everyone that, we're sorry for any inconvenience, but this is not going to happen. We have to cancel it. Behind the scene of those cancellations can be a death in the artist's family, They have to go back to Africa to deal with, a ritual need in their community. And they can't come forward, or it is a visa, denied visa, and we can't publicly say this is why this is happening, because that adds more, you can imagine. So there's things like that, but most of the disappointment really is, I think in myself, was there something else I could have done? And I feel disappointed that there must always be something.
Oh, you are so sweet. You are.
So I take it on.
You are. Would there be anything you'd point to on the other side of the coin? You're like your biggest triumph, something that, stands out above all the rest, or one or two of those kind of things?
Oh, yeah. One of them was obviously when I was very young. I think it was 1995, I founded the Portland Institute for Contemporary Art, which literally was, I'd been working in an art museum. The directorship at the time was putting a lot of accelerated pressure over those of us who are working in contemporary forms. And I was like, oh God, I have to make a decision. Do I work for the institution or do I work for the people? And it was about working for the people. People meaning artists, audiences, people who really cared about this stuff. This director was not going to undergird and support very easily. So I realized I had momentum on my side if I quit and resigned from my position, but did not take another position in Portland or somewhere else. And I felt like I need to do this thing because we need something totally dedicated to contemporary practitioners in all forms. And that was a huge triumph. Everyone said, it's impossible. You're never going to be able to get this off the ground. That's like a red rag to a bull, literally. Anytime I'm told that I absolutely cannot, I'm like, this is ample reason to try 5 times harder. So that was one. In terms of working with artists, one of the projects that I had presented was with a theater maker. I think she's like a master in her 80s now, Ariane Minushkin, and she runs a theater company that has been long standing outside of Paris at the Cartoucherie called Théâtre du Soleil. She made an absolute masterwork. It had to exist in 2 parts. It had the whole ensemble, which was about 85 people, and I brought them to the Melbourne International Arts Festival. And that had a lot of political headwinds against it. It was about the odysseys of refugees, why they're fleeing their countries of origin, where they're aiming at. Part 1 was the flight to get to somewhere else, usually young women that are moved out because their fathers and parents know that they are going to be suffering deep violence if they're not out when a political regime takes over. And the second half of it was how the complexity of Australia, Europe, and the US deal with refugees. And this was obviously quite some time ago. But to get that overseas, it was like 12 freight containers for the setting. I mean, it was huge, but it had a massive impact in the Australian audiences. And it had a massive impact in my relationship with Ariane. And she is somebody I'm trying to eventually get back to Los Angeles, because the last time she was here was the 84 Olympic Cultural Festival. So that was a triumph. And then here, I feel like being able to shift an institution that had started to focus so much on music, a little bit of theater on the side. It was in kind of decline when it was called UCLA Live. I think many people felt that decline in the audience base here was connected to the idea that UCLA itself did not necessarily want progressive contemporary work, and they were trying to make it more populist. It wasn't that at all. So when I came on board, when we shifted it from UCLA Live to Center for the Art of Performance, you're really you're declaring what your focus is in the name of your organization. We're centered on the art of performance, and we do so for people. So shifting that and turning that ship around, which also meant the audience would become much more diverse. They would be more adventurous, less complacent. That's a lot to kind of manifest. But I started seeing a couple of years ago that the change of the programming and the change of focusing on different art forms that had been more neglected, and the change in the people who were coming, the audiences and the members, literally was like, oh my gosh, this is a huge way of also talking about Los Angeles itself, a community of highly engaged citizens who are literally embracing cross-cultural ideas and sensibilities, because we certainly can, but it's not always the identity LA has. So it's great to be able to carry Los Angeles and the kind of capacity we have for creativity, not just entertainment, into, you know, the rest of the country's understanding of, in the art world anyway, the understanding of LA, like the museums have done for many years here, but the performing arts perhaps less so, and internationally as well. So now we are literally a place where people deeply, the artistic world deeply wants to spend time on our stages in Los Angeles to be part of that stew.
We are so lucky to have you. I started this out just absolutely right. What about heart's desire? Is there something that you long for, something on your bucket list maybe?
This is another condition, I think, of our times in the arts in the US, but unlike Europe or Australia or South America or Africa for that matter, or Canada, pretty much we're standing on our own here. I've started to really notice the profound challenges that emerging artists face because of the conditions. They don't yet have a name or an identity with a public. They can achieve that maybe through short things they put out on Facebook, but that's not the same as achieving a practice with a public on a stage. And emerging artists, they can be incredibly technically sophisticated, but who's going to give them a chance? And the old history, like in music, you could go up to the Sunset Strip and you could play for beer. Do you know what I mean? And maybe develop a fan base. But even the club promoters now are not going to take a risk on somebody unless their identity is big enough to sell beer to the audience. So there's market forces that are preventing them from getting a foothold. And it used to be probably even like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, these artists who were emerging, they would make a mark or probably choose other pathways in life within 5 to 7 years of finishing college or conservatory training or an apprenticeship. It didn't take forever. Now it takes 15 to 20 years for even the most extraordinary artist to gain enough foothold to really start to bend the needle towards what their ethos and contributions are going to do in terms of impacting others. And the other thing is that many of the very established artists, like Philip Glass or Chick Corea for that matter, or Lucinda Child in dance, they have large projects that they're working on that will go into the opera world or the symphonic world, or a big jazz presence and a big concert, maybe at the Hollywood Bowl, but that takes years to develop the resourcing to be able to pull that together. And so, let alone the work itself. And a lot of artists want to stay in communion with the public and their fans, but they don't have a small, intimate space to do it. So when we purchased the old Crest Theater, in enormous thanks to Susan Nimoy, and we will end up naming it after Leonard. It'll be called the Nimoy Theater. This is really a place that has 250 seats writ large. It's flexible, it works, and it'll be a place where the market pressures on young artists are not so impacting. The finances of the space are not going to break their back or ours. And the same for artists who are very established. I think of like Nils Klein, and we can put him on Royce Hall every so often with 1,800 seats, but in between, he has small ideas and things they want to try out. And so something like the Nimoy is going to become a hub for these kinds of sensibilities. And it's not just the center who will be presenting work there. It will be the Young Arts Foundation out of Miami with young artists and their alumni. It'll be the Jazz Bakery, who is itinerant now, having another home to be able to present work. So in a way, it's like, how do you create affordable housing for extraordinary ideas in an intimate way that doesn't cost so much in the gentrification of a city that no one can afford to convene with ease and comfort and a sense of familiarity, other not-for-profits and us and the artists and the public. And so it's really exciting, but I still got to raise, like another $8 million or something. So it's not exactly simple, but it's about creating enough of a security base that even there we'll put in technology that reduces the amount of crew time hours. We are going to use each other's databases to create a market for small companies that just don't have a market reach. So it's super exciting because it addresses the creative development necessities of another generation and an existing generation that wants to try things out with the public, as opposed to recognizing this work has to be on absolute pinpoint top form before it goes into an 1,800 seat venue.
I am so glad I asked you that question because I love that answer. It's exciting to me that, yet another venue, another aspect of, how LA can be exciting and original and inventive. And I mean, really, when is that? You haven't got the money.
Well, no, we're in the design phase right now with the architects and looking at how we, this is a historic venue, and its history is fascinating, but it was originally kind of helped to be built in 1939. I think it opened in 1940 by Jane Fonda's mom, and it was a performance space. But World War II, in that time, it quickly was commandeered to become a cinema that they could show the daily newsreels from the front, because there was a lot of working class people in that Westwood area, and the Persian migration, all these folks that were around there. It would be like your CNN now, you would go there to see the newsreels from the day. And it just kept staying as a cinema over time and was, countless owners. Then Disney bought it and renovated it in the 1980s to make it this faux Art Deco-esque looking venue. And a lot of people saw Hollywood films, and then another owner, etc. And then it was, abandoned. It's been absolutely, in decline through the neglect. The thing with theater spaces is they decline very fast if no one's in them, using them. So it's in deep decline. So we raised the money to purchase it. Now we're doing the renovation to figure out what we need to do to restore it as a cultural asset, as well as make it useful for performance. And we will still do, film screenings in there, but usually the kind like the Bill Morrison project we have coming, where it's live scores with musicians to film, or digital projection kind of abstract paintings that could happen. So there's going to be a lot of different things that happen in there. If everything stays on track, if I can, raise the remainder, which I think I'll be able to do, because we don't typically ask for that kind of resource investment for projects. It would open in the fall of 2021. The gifts will be incremental, and those incremental gifts, one of them from an anonymous contributor created a $2.5 million gift if we can match it, and we have to make that match by January. So that creates a new chunk that allows us to pursue the contractors, and it's all, talk about having nerves of steel. This is definitely one of them.
Okay, audience, you hear what your challenge is. What would you say is your mission in life? I do ask that of everyone. What would you say your mission in life is?
I think my mission is, or maybe where a gift of some purpose is that I love building synergies between people, complete strangers. It's sort of like, my grandfather was a bridge builder and an engineer, and he was uncannily excellent at finding where best to build a bridge. And that's what I think I maybe inherited from him. How do I build a bridge where there may not be rational logic that drives it, or some kind of direct economy that will drive it, but really it's about identifying a place that spans a divide and connects people that don't know they could be connected. For me, the bridge that is the most resonant is artists working in different forms who are seeking the same thing. And how do we gather around some form of expressive truth that connects us from being strangers to being part of something, part of a common experience, or part of a sense of discovery, or being illuminated to one another's plights, or all of those things. And so to me, artists are the bridge, and they're the bridge between a kind of expressive truth that makes us feel more awake to the world than we were. But it also, when we have artists in our lives, we can find camaraderie and strangers all over the world, that have a relationship to that artist or to that project or that art form or that sculptor. It's literally a way of knitting together this kind of river of culture throughout the world. And I do it by supporting the artists who approach that with integrity and love.
Maybe your sense of mission is why I'm so attracted to you. Listen, this is called searching for unity in everything.
Right?
You and me, baby.
You and me, baby.
So one last thing I've asked everyone, what perhaps would be a one-line message to the world?
Get it together. We got to get it together.
Get it together. That might be okay. That fits with all the rest.
Yeah.
Really. Actually, I also left out something that we didn't talk about that I would like to hear. What I'm focused on, what I do focus on significantly, is what I call evolutionary ideas. Is it possible to come up with things that actually will change the world? And I read or heard in an interview with you some wonderful things that you said. And if you don't remember them, I'll read them to you. Okay. I develop a platform for the 1% to redirect half of their annual monetary accruals into deeply inspired purposes that leave a profound legacy. I don't know if you can improve on that, but I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah. It's almost like we've evolved into having two completely different species. And at a certain point, when you have billions of assets, billions of dollars, honestly, God, you can't take it with you. And what is it doing beyond the extraordinary luxury of competitive personal wealth? So I do think that accessing this 1%, which is only, the wealth disparity is getting so obscene. We have a global caste system in trade, and it's feeding into a 1% that in turn is not able to feed back into. It's like watching some suction, some giant vacuum just soaking up the resource capacity to be invested to make more resource. So even people like back in the day, the Ted Turners of the world, or, Bill Gates, they have driven a ton of their personal wealth into foundations, giving, et cetera, et cetera. And I just think that there's some, not to sound revolutionary or radical or anarchic, but the rage that sits in, and the anxiety and the fear that always inside of people brings us not towards our highest and best usually, but to our most conniving and desperate. This is increasing. And the 1% holding that amount of the world's wealth, turning it back towards the world, is going to be an imperative. So I definitely think that.
Yeah, people should listen to my podcast with Joel Solomon for other aspects of just what we're talking about now. Another thing that you said having to do with money that I liked and how, you change the world. You said, I'd start with the redistribution of the U.S. military budget by at least $2 billion a year and funnel the moolah into education as a principal inalienable right.
Yes.
Really another obscenity that, where's this money going? And our humanity is so much more important than all that excess money. And yet. And then there's one other thing you said that I really loved. I'd make sure there was an artist in residence in every bureaucracy we've established to date. I love that one.
Absolutely.
Really. That's a world changer.
Yeah. And that one would probably be the easiest to achieve, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm.
How do you put an artist in residence inside of every bureaucratic system that we have? Because again, those things, at least in the US, it's slightly different internationally, but there's a kind of fear of inventing other ways. And so it's just about hyper over perfecting some acronym regulation thing that's impenetrable for most. And I do think that if an artist was there, entrusted to be creatively thinking through this stuff, people would find this amazing different purpose. You know, there's a time period in Australia when the prime minister and the party, whether Labour or Liberal, is elected, and the outgoing finishes, and then the incoming starts, like, I think it's 10 days or something after. That 10-day period is what the country calls going into caretaker mode. And what caretaker mode is it's a chance for the national bureaucracies and the governmental infrastructures that are stable to demonstrate to the public that the culture will move forward regardless of who is in the political driver's seat, the continuation of the roads and various other systems and the healthcare system. And so it's a way to say, we're in solidarity with the service to a public. And in this time period, before the next new prime minister and cabinet come in, we're in caretaker mode to show you that our duty of care is directly connected to the citizens and that we function just fine. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
And it's a beautiful thing because it creates a feeling that the bureaucracy is there to protect and serve, that as part of the democracy, people take on, you know, the bureaucrats are not a dirty word. They are actually engaged in the portfolio of leadership, regardless of how much political injection of resources will come, to uphold a duty of care to the citizens.
Well, how we need a more enlightened world. And a lot of it, you know, isn't like, oh, really difficult. It's just getting a better idea. Well, I'll end this by thanking you for introducing so many of the better ideas that would help us be that better world. Kristy, what can I say? I mean, I'm in love with you. What can I say?
Oh, right back at you, Sue. And thank you for all your work in the world and the ethos in which you approach it and the philosophy of care that you exude in every moment. So I am so lucky you're on board with the center and just independently out there in the world doing your thing. Thank you.
Well, I'll be giving you a hug pretty soon when the CAP program starts. Okay, all you listeners, get your checkbooks out, become donors, not to mention large donors. And Kristy, until we meet soon, we're on Zoom here now in cyberspace, but until we get to those real hugs, which I look forward to with every performance, thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thank you.
Now Suzanne takes your hand and she leads you to the river.
So, dear listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode of Searching for Unity in Everything, Meaningful Conversations with Meaningful People. Do subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss any episodes. And check out suspeaks.org/podcast for notes about this one. To make any comments on it, go to our blog on suspeaks.org, where we made a post about this episode. How did you feel about what you heard? Did you learn anything, or were you inspired to act in any new way? Or do you perhaps disagree with anything that was said? Also, while you're on our website, do explore and comment on some of the other content. There's a cup of consciousness for everyone.
And you want to travel with her, and you want to travel blind, and you know you can trust her, for she's touched your perfect body with her mind.